The click of the handcuffs was unnervingly loud in the serene quiet of the Virginia suburb, a sharp metallic sound that cut through the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming azaleas. That single sound would trigger a chain reaction that no one saw coming. For the two police officers, it was just another stop, another assertion of authority on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. For the woman, they were cuffing a woman in simple civilian clothes, standing by her modest sedan. It was an insult that would echo all the way to the nerve center of the United States military. They thought they were arresting a car thief. They had just illegally detained 3-star General Diana Washington, and she was about to make one phone call that would not just end their careers, but dismantle their entire world. The sun cast a warm, golden hue over the manicured lawns of Oak Creek, Virginia. It was a town of quiet wealth and unspoken rules, where the rustle of leaves in the wind was often the loudest sound on the street. For Lieutenant General Diana Washington, this tranquility was a world away from the sterile, high-tempo environment of Fort Meade, where she commanded the U.S. Army Cyber Command. Here in Oak Creek, she wasn't a 3-star general. She was just Daisy, a daughter visiting her ailing mother, Carol. Her mother's house was a modest, single-story brick home, dwarfed by the newer, more ostentatious constructions that had sprung up around it over the years. Carol had lived there for 40 years, and the house, much like her, was full of grace history and a quiet refusal to change with the times. Diana's car, a respectable but unremarkable 10-year-old Lexus sedan, was parked at the curb. It was her civilian car, deliberately chosen to avoid drawing attention. In her world, attention was a liability. She had just finished helping her mother with some gardening, her hand still carrying the faint, earthy scent of soil, despite a thorough washing. They sat on the porch swing, sipping iced tea, the gentle creak of the chains, a soothing rhythm. "You worry too much," Daisy Carroll said, her voice thin but steady. "Flying all the way out here for a little cough. Mum, the doctor, said to keep an eye on it. And besides," Diana smiled, taking her mother's hand, "I wanted to see you. It's not every day a general gets to play hooky to hang out with her favorite lady." The moment was perfect, a small pocket of peace in a life defined by immense pressure and global responsibility. As the commander of Cybercom, Diana Washington was one of the most powerful military figures in the nation. She was responsible for the defense of the Department of Defense's information networks, a silent, perpetual war fought in the ones and zeros of cyberspace. Her days were a blur of classified briefings, strategic planning, and decisions that carried the weight of national security. She had served 2 tours in Iraq, not in a command tent, but on the front lines of electronic warfare. She was a West Point graduate with a doctorate from MIT. Her mind was a fortress, her demeanor one of unshakable calm. But here on this porch she was just a daughter. She wore simple grey slacks and a black polo shirt, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Nothing about her screamed general. There was no uniform, no entourage, no visible sign of the immense authority she wielded. As the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Diana decided to make a quick run to the pharmacy for her mother's prescription refill. "I'll be back in 20 minutes, Mum. Don't you move a muscle." She kissed her mother's forehead and walked towards her Lexus. The street was empty, save for a neighbor walking a golden retriever a block away. She unlocked the car, the electronic beep echoing slightly in the quiet air, and slid into the driver's seat. She put the key in the ignition, but before she could turn it, she saw the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. A brand new Oak Creek Police Department cruiser had pulled up silently behind her, its engine a low hum. It hadn't been there seconds ago. Diana felt a familiar, unwelcome prickle of caution. She remained perfectly still, her hands visible on the steering wheel, waiting. 2 officers emerged from the cruiser. The one from the driver's side was older, with a stocky build and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. His name tag read, Hayes. The other was younger, leaner, with the uncertain air of a rookie. His tag said, Miller. Officer Hayes strolled towards her driver's side window with a practiced, intimidating slowness. He tapped on the glass with a thick knuckle. Diana smoothly powered down the window, her expression neutral. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice calm and even. "License and registration." Hayes grunted, forgoing any pleasantries. His eyes roamed over the interior of her car, lingering on her simple handbag on the passenger seat before settling back on her face. It was a look she had seen before, in other places at other times. It was a look of instant judgment of suspicion, searching for a cause. "Of course," she replied, reaching slowly and deliberately for the glove compartment. "May I ask what the problem is?" "Your vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen in the county an hour ago," Hayes stated flatly. Diana paused, her hand hovering. It was a lie, and she knew it. Her car was registered to her with a spotless record at a secure address on a military base. No one had stolen it. This was a pretext. The quiet street, the old car, her black skin in Officer Hayes's mind, the pieces didn't fit together in this neighborhood. "I can assure you, officer, this vehicle is not stolen," she said, retrieving the registration and her driver's license. She handed them over. Hayes snatched the documents from her hand. He glanced at them, a flicker of something, disappointment, annoyance, crossing his face when he saw the name. Diana Washington. He then looked at the address on her license, a P.O. box at Fort Meade. "Fort Meade, huh?" he said, a cynical sneer twisting his lips. "You military?" "Yes, I am, Diana," said simply, offering no further detail. She was a private citizen on private time. Her rank had no bearing here. Hayes exchanged a look with Miller, who was standing back near the hood of her car, looking uncomfortable. Hayes handed the license to Miller. "Run it," he commanded. As Miller walked back to the cruiser, Hayes leaned against the car door, invading her personal space. "So what are you doing all the way out here in Oak Creek, Diana? A little far from base, isn't it?" "I'm visiting my mother," she said, her voice still level, but a cold knot was tightening in her stomach. "She lives right here." She gestured towards the brick house. Hayes didn't even glance at it. His focus was entirely on her. His eyes narrowed. "Right. Visiting your mother. In a car that looks like one that just got boosted. Convenient." The tone was deliberately inflammatory. He was baiting her, looking for a reaction, for any excuse to escalate. Diana had dealt with volatile insurgents in combat zones and hostile foreign dignitaries in tense negotiations. She knew how to maintain her composure. She would not give him the satisfaction. She simply waited. The silence stretched, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of traffic. Miller returned from the cruiser holding the license. "Everything's clean," Mark Miller said, quietly. "License is valid, no warrants. Car is registered to her at the address listed." This was the moment of truth. The pretext had evaporated. The correct lawful procedure was to apologize for the mistake and leave. But Diana could see in Officer Hayes's eyes that he had no intention of doing that. He had already committed to a narrative in his head, and the facts were merely an inconvenience. Clean Hayes scoffed, not looking at his partner. He stared directly at Diana. "I'm not so sure. Something feels off here. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle." The storm had arrived. A line had been drawn and crossed. Diana Washington knew it instantly. The request to exit the vehicle after her identity and ownership had been unequivocally confirmed was no longer a matter of procedure. It was an exercise of dominance. "Officer, on what grounds?" she asked. Her voice was still calm, but it now carried a new edge, a precision honed by years of command. "My license is valid, my registration is in order, and there are no warrants for my arrest. You have no probable cause to detain me further." Officer Hayes's scowl Daisy penned. He seemed personally offended that she knew her rights and was articulate enough to state them. "My grounds are that I'm conducting an investigation. Now I'm not going to ask you again. Step out of the car." He placed his hand on the butt of his service weapon, a gesture that was both unmistakable and entirely unnecessary. From the porch, Carol had noticed the flashing lights and was now standing by the door, her face etched with worry. Diana gave her a slight, almost imperceptible shake of the head, a silent command to stay put. The last thing she needed was for her mother with her fragile health to be drawn into this. Slowly, deliberately, Diana unbuckled her seatbelt. She opened the door and stepped out onto the asphalt, her movements fluid and controlled. She stood to her full height of 5 feet 9 inches, meeting Hayes's gaze without flinching. "All right, I'm out of the car," she said. "Now what?" "Turn around. Place your hands behind your back," Hayes ordered. This was the unbelievable escalation. This was the point of no return. "You have got to be kidding me," Diana said, the first trace of disbelief coloring her tone. "You are not putting me in handcuffs. It's for my safety." And yours, Hayes recited the words, sounding hollow and rehearsed. "Until we can be sure this situation is clear. The situation is clear." Officer Diana retorted, her patience wearing thin. "You've run my information. There is no crime. You are unlawfully detaining me." "Mark, maybe we should just—" Miller started taking a half step forward. He looked genuinely distressed, his eyes darting from his belligerent partner to Diana, and then to the house, where an elderly woman was now visibly trembling. "Stay out of this, Miller." Hayes snapped his authority challenged. He turned his full attention back to Diana. "Last chance, ma'am. Cooperate or I'll add resisting arrest to the charges." "Charges for what?" "For visiting my mother in a car that I legally own." The absurdity of the situation was staggering. Diana had briefed presidents, commanded thousands of soldiers, and held the nation's digital keys in her hands. Now she was being threatened with arrest on a quiet suburban street for an imaginary crime. She made a calculated decision. Resisting physically would only make things worse, potentially dangerously so. The battle she needed to fight wasn't a physical one on this curb. With a deep, steadying breath, she turned around her back, straight as a ramrod. She presented her wrists. It was a gesture of compliance, but it felt like a declaration of war. The cold steel of the handcuffs closed around her wrists. The click echoed in the quiet air, a sound of profound finality. It was a sound of humiliation, of injustice. For a moment, Diana Washington, the 3-star general, felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a hot, primal anger that she hadn't felt in years. She crushed it instantly, burying it deep beneath layers of training and discipline. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Cool, calculated thought was the only weapon she had. Hayes roughly patted her down his hands, clumsy and unprofessional. He found nothing, of course. No weapons, no contraband, just a woman in slacks and a polo shirt. "What's your name again?" he asked, a smug tone of victory in his voice. "It's on the license you're holding," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Lieutenant General Diana Washington." Hayes chuckled a harsh, ugly sound. "Lieutenant General, yeah, right. And I'm the King of England. You have the right to remain silent." He began to read her the Miranda rights, the words, a grotesque parody in the context of what was happening. As he spoke, Diana's mind was already working, formulating a strategy. He had made a catastrophic error in judgment, fueled by arrogance and prejudice. He had no idea of the hornet's nest he had just kicked. He thought he was cuffing a nobody. He had no clue he had just declared war on the Pentagon. Miller stood by his face, pale. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He was complicit in his silence, and Diana made a mental note of that as well. In her world, inaction in the face of a critical error was as bad as the error itself. "I want to make a phone call," Diana said, cutting Hayes off as he finished the Miranda warning. "You'll get your phone call at the station?" He sneered, grabbing her arm to lead her toward the cruiser. "No," she said, her voice now dropping to a tone that could freeze water. It was the voice she used when a subordinate was about to make a fatal mistake on a mission. It was a voice that conveyed absolute, non-negotiable authority, and it made both officers pause involuntarily. "I'm making my phone call right now." She looked Hayes dead in the eye. "Trust me, officer. You want me to make this call right now, because if you put me in the back of that car, your life as you know it will be over before the door closes." There was no anger in her voice, no pleading. It was a simple, cold statement of fact. The certainty in her eyes was so absolute that it gave even the arrogant Hayes a moment of pause. He looked at Miller, who just gave a slight, helpless shrug. Hayes hesitated, a flicker of doubt finally piercing his armor of self-importance. "Who are you calling, some two-bit lawyer?" "No," Diana said, a grim, humorless smile touching her lips for the first time. "I'm calling the Pentagon." The statement hung in the air, so audacious and out of place that Officer Hayes could only stare at her. The dissonance was too great, the handcuffed woman in plain clothes, the quiet suburban street, and the mention of the United States military's global headquarters. The Pentagon Hayes finally managed, breaking into a disbelieving laugh. "Lady, you've been watching too much TV. Get in the car. I'd advise against that," Officer Diana said, her gaze unwavering. "The number I need to call is for the National Military Command Center. It's the direct line to the Joint Chiefs of Staff's watch floor. I have a legal right to one phone call. I am invoking that right now before I am transported. The choice is yours." She was bluffing, but only partially. While the NMCC was for operational matters, the principle was sound. The sheer gravity of the names she was using was a calculated shock tactic. She knew the institutional power behind those words. Hayes, a small-town cop, only knew the myths. A seed of genuine uncertainty was now visible on Hayes's face. This woman wasn't hysterical. She wasn't begging. She spoke with the chilling precision of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. He glanced at Miller again, looking for support, but the younger officer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. "Give her the phone." Mark Miller mumbled, his voice barely audible. "What's the harm?" Hayes shot him, a venomous look, but was clearly rattled. What if by some 1,000,000 to 1 chance she wasn't lying? The potential fallout was unthinkable. He made a decision more to call her bluff than anything else. "Fine," he snarled. "You want to make a call? Make your call. Let's see you call the Pentagon." He reached into her handbag, which was still on the passenger seat, and pulled out her smartphone. It was a standard-issue Samsung, but hardened for security. He held it up. "Unlock it." "I can't." "My hands are restrained," she pointed out calmly. With a grunt of frustration, Hayes unlocked the cuffs. The metal sprang open, leaving angry red marks on her wrists. Diana took a moment to rub them, her movements deliberate before taking her phone. She didn't go to her recent calls. She didn't go to her contacts. Her fingers moved with practiced speed, dialing a 10-digit number from memory. It was a number she knew, as well as her own name, a direct line that bypassed public switchboards. Hayes and Miller watched their skepticism, still warring with a growing sense of dread. Diana put the phone to her ear. It rang only once. "Watch floor," a crisp professional voice answered on the other end. "This is General Washington." Diana said, her tone instantly shifting. The suburban daughter was gone. The commander was back. "I need a direct patch to General Fitzpatrick's executive officer. Priority 1. Authentication code is Washington Delta 779er. There was a pause, no longer than a heartbeat. "Stand by, General." The change in the atmosphere was palpable. Hayes and Miller exchanged a wide-eyed look. The terms she used, watch floor, direct patch, priority 1, the alphanumeric authentication code, were not things a civilian fantasist would know. They were the real language of power. Hayes felt a cold sweat prickle the back of his neck. This was going wrong. This was going catastrophically wrong. A new voice came on the line, sharp and attentive. "Ma'am, Colonel Davies here. The General is in a briefing with the SecDef. Can I assist Colonel?" Diana's voice was like ice. "You need to interrupt him. Right now. Inform General Fitzpatrick that I have been unlawfully detained by 2 officers of the Oak Creek Police Department, badge numbers 714 and 822. I am currently and without cause under arrest on the corner of Elm Street and Maple Avenue in Oak Creek, Virginia." She was providing a battle-ready situation report. Who, what, where. Clear, concise, and damning. On the other end of the line, in a soundproof, sensitive, compartmented information facility, deep within the Pentagon, Colonel Davies felt his blood run cold. General Fitzpatrick was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Washington was not just another general. She was a critical component of the nation's defense infrastructure, personally known and respected by the entire Joint Staff. An unlawful arrest of a 3-star general was not a local police matter. It was a potential national security incident. "Understood," General Davies said, his voice tight with urgency. "Hold the line. We are actioning this immediately." Diana held the phone to her ear, her eyes locked on Hayes. The older officer's face had drained of all color. The smugness, the arrogance it had, all vanished, replaced by a ghastly mask of panic. He looked at the badge on his own chest. 714. He looked at Miller. 822. She had read their badge numbers without even appearing to look. What did you do?" Hayes stammered, his tough guy facade crumbling into dust. "I did exactly what I said I was going to do," Diana replied coolly. "I made a phone call." She stayed on the line, listening to the muffled but urgent voices on the other end. She could hear Colonel Davies speaking, his voice low but firm. "Sir, I have to interrupt. It's General Washington. She's been detained." She could almost picture the scene, the halt in the high-level briefing, the confused look on the Secretary of Defense's face, and the thundercloud that would be forming on General James Iron Jim Fitzpatrick's brow. Fitzpatrick was a man who had commanded divisions in Afghanistan. He was legendary for his temper and his fierce loyalty to his people. Detaining one of his senior commanders on a flimsy pretext was like poking a grizzly bear with a sharp stick. Hayes was visibly shaking now. He started to back away, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "Look, Ma'am, there's been a misunderstanding. A simple mistake. It stopped being a mistake when you put your hands on me." "Officer Hayes," Diana said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "It became an assault." Miller, for his part, looked like he was about to be physically sick. He leaned against the cruiser, his face ashen. He knew with absolute certainty that his career, which had barely begun, was over. Diana spoke back into the phone. "Colonel Davies, are you there?" "Yes, General. General Fitzpatrick is on the line." A new voice, a deep baritone that radiated pure command, came through the speaker. It was a voice used to moving armies. "Daisy, what the hell is going on, Jim?" "It's exactly as I told your XO," she said. I'm being held by local police. No cause given." "Stay right where you are," Fitzpatrick's voice boomed audible even to the two terrified officers. "A Judge Advocate General team is spinning up. The U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division is on its way from Fort Belvoir. The local police chief is getting a call from me personally in the next 60 seconds. Do not let those two officers leave your sight." The call ended. Diana lowered the phone and looked at Hayes and Miller. "You heard the man," she said quietly. "Don't go anywhere." They stood frozen on the quiet suburban street, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows. The chirping of the crickets seemed to have stopped. In the silence they could hear the distant but rapidly approaching sound of sirens. But these weren't the familiar yelp of the Oak Creek PD. It was a deeper, more urgent wail. The federal government was coming. The first to arrive was not CID or the JAG Corps, but the Oak Creek Chief of Police himself, John O'Malley. He screeched to a halt in an unmarked sedan skidding on the clean asphalt. He burst out of the car, his face crimson, his uniform hastily thrown on. He was a man who had clearly been in the middle of a peaceful dinner, only to have it interrupted by a phone call from arguably the most powerful military officer in the entire country. Chief O'Malley's eyes, wide with panic, scanned the scene. Two of his officers standing like statues, a distinguished-looking black woman holding a phone, and her elderly mother watching from the porch. He didn't need a diagram to understand the magnitude of the disaster. "Ma'am," he began, addressing Diana with a deference that bordered on terror. "I am Chief O'Malley. I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for this egregious misunderstanding." Before Diana could respond, two black Chevrolet Tahoes with government plates roared down the street and boxed in the police cruiser. Men in sharp suits and military-style haircuts emerged. They were followed by two uniformed military police officers from the Fort Belvoir garrison. The lead agent, a stern-faced man in his 50s, flashed his credentials at O'Malley. "Special Agent Peterson, Army CID. This is now a federal crime scene," he announced, his voice carrying an authority that made the local police chief shrink. "Chief O'Malley, your officers are to be disarmed and placed on administrative leave effective immediately. They are material witnesses in a federal investigation into the violation of a service member's civil rights under color of authority." The legalese was dense, but the message was crystal clear. Hayes and Miller were no longer the ones in control. They were now the subjects of a criminal investigation. A military police officer, a tall, imposing woman, approached Hayes. "Sir, I'm going to need your weapon belt and badge." Hayes, completely broken, complied without a word. He unclipped his duty belt and handed it over his hands, trembling so badly he almost dropped it. He looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. Miller did the same, his movements stiff and robotic. Stripped of their gear, they seemed smaller, diminished. They were no longer symbols of authority. They were just two men in blue uniforms who had made the worst mistake of their lives. Chief O'Malley was trying desperately to salvage the situation, speaking in a low, pleading tone to Agent Peterson. "Look, it was a mistake, a rookie error. Officer Hayes is a veteran, a good cop." Peterson cut him off with a slice of his hand. "Chief, your time to handle this internally ended the moment those handcuffs were placed on a general officer of the United States Army. Right now, your only job is to cooperate." While this was unfolding, a calm, professional-looking woman in a U.S. Army uniform with the distinctive JAG Corps insignia approached Diana. She was a lieutenant colonel. "General Washington," she said, offering a crisp salute. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Evans. General Fitzpatrick sent me." "Are you physically unharmed, ma'am?" "I'm fine," Colonel Diana replied, her composure absolute. "But I want to press charges for assault battery and unlawful imprisonment." "Understood," Ma'am Evans said, making a note on a tablet. "We will pursue this to the fullest extent of federal and state law." The street, once a picture of suburban peace, now looked like a scene from a political thriller. There were federal agents, military lawyers, local police, and stunned neighbors peering from behind their curtains. The balance of power had shifted so violently and so quickly, it was breathtaking. Diana walked over to her mother, who was now being attended to by a military medic who had arrived with the JAG team. She wrapped a comforting arm around her. "It's okay, Mum. It's over now," she said softly. "Who are all these people?" Daisy Carroll asked, her voice trembling. "They're my colleagues," Mum Diana said simply. "They're here to help." The most telling interaction came when Agent Peterson approached Diana. "General, we have a forensics team on the way to process the cruiser and your vehicle. That won't be necessary," Agent Diana said. Peterson looked confused. "Ma'am, Officer Hayes's cruiser has a dash cam," she stated, "and I'm willing to bet that for some reason the recording of the last 30 minutes will be inexplicably corrupted or missing. Officer Miller, on the other hand." She turned her gaze to the younger, pale-faced officer. "His body camera has been blinking a steady red light since the moment he stepped out of the car. Isn't that right?" Officer Miller's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, a sliver of relief. He had followed protocol. He had kept his camera on. Hayes, the veteran, had likely turned his off to avoid accountability for what he knew was a bad stop. Hayes's head fell. It was the final nail in his coffin. There was an objective, high-definition, audio-visual record of the entire incident. Every sneer, every unlawful order, every moment of the illegal detention was captured. Agent Peterson gave a grim nod. He walked over to Miller. "Son, you're going to give that camera to me right now, and then you're going to give a full and complete statement. Your future depends on what you do in the next 5 minutes." Miller, seeing the precipice he was on, looked at Hayes, his partner and mentor, who refused to meet his gaze. Then he looked at the stoic, powerful woman his partner had tried to bully. He made his choice. He reached up and unclipped the body camera. The unraveling was complete. What started as a power trip by a single cop had escalated into a full-blown federal incident, and as Hayes and Miller were escorted to separate vehicles to be taken for questioning, they knew their careers were not just over. They were about to be publicly and permanently destroyed. The wheels of two different yet equally formidable machines began to turn the court of public opinion and the United States Department of Justice. Within 12 hours, the story leaked from a source within the Oak Creek Town Hall hit the press. It started with a local news blog and was then picked up by a national wire service. By noon the next day, it was the lead story on every major news network. Black female general wrongfully arrested in affluent Virginia suburb. The headlines were explosive. The story had everything: racial profiling, abuse of power, and the dramatic twist of the victim's true identity. The narrative was irresistible. General Diana Washington, a decorated war hero and protector of the nation, had been treated like a common criminal in her own country. The dashcam and bodycam footage released by federal authorities went viral. The world saw Officer Hayes's smug arrogance and heard his dismissive laugh when Diana stated her rank. They saw Miller's silent, damning complicity. The Oak Creek Police Department was besieged. The town hall's phone lines were jammed with furious callers from all over the country. Protesters, both local and from out of state, began to gather peacefully outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Accountability and Justice for General Washington." For Mark Hayes, the world collapsed with breathtaking speed. He was fired, but that was just the beginning. The DOJ, led by a tenacious prosecutor from the Civil Rights Division, named Elena Rios, unsealed an indictment. The charges were not just about the one incident. The federal investigation had cracked open his entire career. Agent Peterson's team, digging into Hayes's jacket, discovered a pattern. Over his 15-year career, Mark Hayes had amassed a dozen excessive force complaints, all filed by minority individuals. Every single one had been dismissed internally by his friend, the department's internal affairs sergeant. His arrest statistics showed a staggering racial disparity. He was in the cold, hard language of the data, a predator who used his badge to terrorize people he thought were powerless. The corrupted dashcam footage from Diana's arrest was the key. Federal cyber forensics experts, the very kind of people who worked for General Washington, retrieved the deleted file from the cruiser's hard drive in under an hour. It showed Hayes clearly reaching up and deactivating the camera just before he approached Diana's car. This act transformed the case from an abuse of power into a federal crime obstruction of justice and falsification of an official record. Hayes, who had once held all the power on that quiet street, now found himself powerless. His union-appointed lawyer advised him to plead guilty and hope for mercy. His photo was plastered across newspapers and websites, his face a new symbol of police misconduct. His friends stopped calling. His neighbors crossed the street to avoid him. He was a pariah. Chris Miller's fate was different, but no less life-altering. He cooperated fully from the moment he handed over his body camera. He sat with Agent Peterson and the DOJ prosecutors for 8 hours, giving a sworn videotaped statement that detailed not only the events of that afternoon, but other instances where he had felt Hayes had crossed the line. He admitted his own cowardice, his fear of contradicting a senior officer, his shame at having stood by and done nothing. For his cooperation, the DOJ offered him a deal he would not face criminal charges, but he had to resign from the police force immediately and surrender his law enforcement certification, ensuring he could never be a cop anywhere in the country again. He also had to agree to testify against Hayes. Miller accepted without hesitation. He lost his dream job, the only career he'd ever wanted, but in doing so, he saved himself from federal prison and took the first step toward reclaiming his soul. His karma was not a prison sentence, but a lifetime of knowing he had failed a critical test of character and the long, hard road of rebuilding a life outside the only one he'd ever known. Meanwhile, General Washington maintained a dignified silence. She gave one official statement through an army spokesperson: "I have full faith in the justice system. This incident is now in their hands. I am focused on my duties and the defense of our nation." But behind the scenes, she was not passive. She spoke at length with prosecutor Elena Rios, providing a clear, precise, and devastatingly effective account of the events. She was the perfect witness, unimpeachable articulate, and possessing a memory for detail that was second to none. The system that Hayes had manipulated for years was now being turned against him with relentless, overwhelming force. The gears of justice were grinding, and they were grinding him into dust. The karma was not just a loss of a job. It was the complete and total demolition of his life, his reputation, and his freedom, broadcast for the entire world to see. The day Mark Hayes stood before a federal judge for sentencing was a cold, gray morning in Alexandria, Virginia. The courtroom was packed. In the front row sat General Diana Washington in full Class A uniform. She was not there out of spite, but out of duty. She was there as a representative not just of the armed forces, but of every person who had ever been voiceless in the face of similar abuse. Her presence was a silent, powerful testament to the gravity of the proceedings. Hayes, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, was a shadow of his former self. The swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed desperation. He had pleaded guilty to perjury and violating a citizen's civil rights. His lawyer painted a picture of a burnt-out, stressed cop who had made a terrible mistake. Then Prosecutor Elena Rios rose to speak. "Your Honor," she began, her voice ringing with clarity. "This was not a mistake. It was a choice. It was the culmination of 1,000 small choices made over a 15-year career. It was the choice to see a black woman in a nice neighborhood as a suspect, not a resident. The choice to ignore exculpatory evidence. The choice to escalate, to intimidate, and to abuse. The choice to lie and to cover it up." She gestured towards Diana. The victim of this crime happened to be a 3-star general, but the crime would have been no less egregious had she been a teacher, a nurse, or a student. The only difference is that we wouldn't be here. The only difference is that Mr. Hayes would have gotten away with it, as he had so many times before. His bad luck was that, on this day, he chose the wrong citizen to bully. When it was Hayes's turn to speak, he gave a mumbled, incoherent apology, his eyes fixed on the floor. It was the pathetic whimper of a man who was sorry only because he had been caught. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense man named Lawrence Finnegan, looked down at Hayes with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Hayes, you took an oath to uphold the law. Instead, you became a law unto yourself. You tarnished your badge, you betrayed your community, and you violated the sacred trust placed in you. The fact that your victim was a senior military officer is an aggravating factor, not because her rights are more valuable, but because it reveals the depth of your arrogance. You assumed she was powerless. You could not have been more wrong." The sentence came down like a hammer blow. "On the charge of perjury, I sentence you to 3 years in federal prison. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, I sentence you to 5 years. The sentences will be served consecutively, 8 years." A gasp went through the courtroom. It was a significant, borderline, unprecedented sentence for such a case. The message was unmistakable. Mark Hayes swayed on his feet as U.S. Marshals moved in to take him into custody. As they led him away in handcuffs, the same instrument of humiliation he had so carelessly used on Diana, his eyes met the general's for a fleeting second. He saw no triumph in her gaze, no hatred. He saw only a profound, unshakable resolve. He saw justice. The reckoning extended to the Oak Creek Police Department. Chief O'Malley was forced to resign in disgrace. The Department of Justice launched a full-scale pattern and practice investigation into the department, uncovering systemic issues of racial bias and a broken culture of accountability. The town was forced into a federal consent decree, a costly and humiliating process of court-ordered reform. The karma had hit back with the force of a tidal wave, washing away not just one man's career, but exposing the rotten foundations of the entire institution he had worked for. The single click of those handcuffs had triggered an earthquake, and the aftershocks would reshape the landscape of Oak Creek for years to come. A year later, Lieutenant General Diana Washington stood at a podium at West Point, addressing the graduating class of cadets. The sun glinted off the polished brass on her uniform and the 3 silver stars on her shoulders. The incident in Oak Creek was a memory, but it was also now a part of her story, a part she had decided to use. Leadership. She said her voice, resonating across the field, is not just about leading soldiers in battle. It is not just about strategy or tactics. It is at its core about character. It's about who you are when no one is looking or when you think the person in front of you doesn't matter. She told them the story, not in detail, but the essence of it. She spoke of the abuse of power she had witnessed and experienced. That officer on that street had power, she explained, but he lacked authority. Power is the ability to force compliance. Authority is the right to command it, earned through integrity, discipline, and respect for the rights of others. He had a badge and a gun, but he had no true authority. Your uniform will give you power. Your character is what will give you authority. Never confuse the two. The experience had changed her. It had left a scar, a quiet reminder of the battles that were fought not in foreign lands, but on the streets of her own country. It reinforced her belief that the principles she defended, justice, liberty, and the rule of law, were not abstract concepts, but fragile ideals that required constant vigilance. After the speech, a young, bright-eyed African-American female cadet approached her. "General," the cadet said, her voice filled with awe, "what you did, what you went through. It was incredible. Thank you for not backing down." Diana smiled a genuine, warm smile. "The standard you walk past is the standard you accept, cadet. I just refused to walk past it." The lives of the other players had settled into their new realities. Mark Hayes was inmate, Wajahunaya 75382-0083, at a medium-security federal correctional institution. He had lost his pension, his home, and his family. His name was now a case study in law enforcement academies on how not to behave. Chris Miller was working as a night shift manager at a logistics warehouse in a different state. It was a humbling, anonymous job. He had sent a handwritten letter to General Washington 6 months after the incident, a long, heartfelt apology for his weakness and his silence. He didn't expect a reply. To his surprise, he received one. It was a short, typewritten note on official Department of the Army letterhead. It said simply, "Mr. Miller, a single choice can define a life. Your testimony required courage. Use that courage to build a better life. I wish you peace." He kept that letter in his wallet. It was both a reminder of his greatest failure and a seed of hope for his redemption. General Diana Washington stood on the hills overlooking the Hudson River, watching the new generation of leaders she had just addressed. She had faced down enemies on digital battlefields and terrorists in dusty war zones. But one of her greatest victories had come on a quiet suburban street, armed with nothing but her character, her discipline, and a single phone call. The karma that had struck down Officer Hayes wasn't supernatural. It was the inevitable logical consequence of a broken man coming up against an unbreakable woman. And in the end, her quiet strength had proven to be the most powerful weapon of all. 3 years after Mark Hayes was sentenced in a cramped fluorescent-lit office in Richmond, a young lawyer named Ben Carter was staring at a case file that was giving him a headache. He worked for the Virginia Innocence Project, a non-profit that fought to exonerate the wrongfully convicted. The case on his desk was that of a man named Marcus Thorne, who was serving a 20-year sentence for armed robbery. The evidence had always been thin, based almost entirely on a single shaky eyewitness ID and a supposed confession. Thorne had sworn from day one that the confession was coerced after hours of intimidation in an interrogation room. The arresting officer, the one who had secured the confession, had signed the report with a flourish. Ben traced the signature with his finger. Officer Mark Hayes. The name made Ben sit up straight. He remembered the case, of course. The whole country did. The story of the general and the arrogant cop had been legendary, but for Ben it was more than a viral news story. It was a legal precedent. The DOJ's investigation into Hayes had been thorough, and the findings had been sealed, but were known to be extensive. Ben's mind began to race. What if Marcus Thorne wasn't an outlier? What if he was just one of the many victims who didn't have a direct line to the Pentagon? He spent the next week drafting a meticulous motion, petitioning the court to unseal the DOJ's internal affairs investigation into Mark Hayes, citing its relevance to the Thorne case. He called the U.S. Attorney's office and managed to get a 10-minute phone call with Eleanor Rios, the prosecutor, who had put Hayes away. "You're barking up the right tree," Mr. Carter Rios told him, her voice still as sharp as it had been in the courtroom. Hayes's pattern of behavior was deeply entrenched. We focused on the Washington case because it was ironclad, but there was a mountain of other material. Look specifically at his handling of evidence in cases where the suspect was a minority without private counsel. You'll find a pattern of things going missing. Armed with this, Ben won his motion. A federal judge ordered a partial unsealing of the Hayes files, specifically those pertaining to his past arrests and complaint history. When the boxes of documents arrived, it was like opening a Pandora's box of injustice. The files confirmed everything Marcus Thorne had claimed, and more. Hayes had a documented history of interrogating suspects for hours without counsel, of fudging timelines on reports, and of a half-dozen cases where crucial potentially exculpatory evidence, like a security tape or a conflicting witness statement, was noted in preliminary logs, but was officially lost before trial. He was a bully with a badge, but he was also a methodical saboteur of justice, skilled at burying his misconduct in paperwork. The most damning discovery in Marcus Thorne's file was a buried supplemental report from Officer Chris Miller, written a day after the arrest. In it, Miller had noted that Thorne had repeatedly asked for a lawyer, a fact Hayes had omitted from the official interrogation summary. Hayes had later disciplined Miller for improper filing and had the report buried in the archives. It was the smoking gun. 6 months later, Marcus Thorne walked out of prison, a free man, his conviction overturned. He had served 9 years of a 20-year sentence for a crime he didn't commit. His exoneration was a local news story, but it was the first domino. Ben Carter and his team, using the Hayes files as a roadmap, began reviewing every single felony conviction Hayes had ever secured. The unforeseen ripple of General Washington's stand had become a tidal wave. Over the next 2 years, the Virginia Innocence Project, citing the now infamous Hayes pattern, successfully secured the release of 3 more men. Dozens of other cases were reopened for review. Hayes's legacy was not just of a disgraced cop in prison. It was of a cancerous presence whose poison was being systematically purged from the justice system, one overturned conviction at a time. In a small town in Ohio, Chris Miller was coaching his son's little league team. He had found his footing. After receiving the general's letter, he'd started volunteering, speaking to youth groups and even to police cadets at a local community college. He never made excuses for his actions. He told his story as a cautionary tale about the poison of silence and the moral courage required to wear a badge. He wasn't a cop anymore, but he was, for the first time in his life, serving a community. He was rebuilding his life, not on a foundation of authority, but of humility. And in Washington, D.C., the world had continued to turn. Diana Washington, now wearing a 4th star, was the commanding general of U.S. Army Forces Command. Her name was on the short list to become the first female chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She was at her desk reviewing logistical reports for troop movements in Europe when her aide brought in a piece of personal mail. It was a simple handwritten letter in a plain white envelope. It read, "Dear General Washington, my name is Marcus Thorne. You don't know me, but you saved my life. I was in prison for 9 years for a crime I didn't commit. The cop who put me there was Mark Hayes. When you stood up to him, you did it for yourself, but you also did it for me and for all the others like me who didn't have a voice. Because of you, they opened his files. Because of you, I am free. I am home with my daughter. I will never be able to thank you enough for your courage. Sincerely, Marcus Thorne." General Washington folded the letter and put it in her top desk drawer. She looked out her window at the distant shape of the Washington Monument. She had never sought revenge against Mark Hayes. she had only demanded accountability. She had believed that a single act of holding the line of insisting on the principles the nation was supposed to stand for was its own reward. She had been wrong. The reward wasn't just in her own vindication. It was in the quiet freedom of a man she would never meet, in the restoration of a family she would never know. The ripples of that day on that quiet suburban street had traveled further than she could have ever imagined carrying with them the cleansing, unstoppable power of justice. The story of General Diana Washington is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the uniform you wear or the power you wield, but about the integrity you hold within. It's a story of karma, but more importantly, of accountability. It shows how one person's refusal to be victimized can expose a corrupt system and force a reckoning that was long overdue. The world is full of Officer Hayes people who abuse their sliver of power, believing they are invincible. But it is also full of General Washington's people whose quiet dignity and unshakable character can bring empires of arrogance crashing down. If this story of justice and consequence resonated with you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. For more true stories of karma, accountability, and the hidden battles that define our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue to bring these important narratives to light. Thank you for listening.